So now it is a privilege to introduce the first speaker, and just to remind our speakers that there is a time limit on your input, and when there's only 5 minutes left, the 5-minute signs will be walked, and if there's 2 minutes left, the 2-minute signs will be walked, and then after that I cannot guarantee what will happen. But it's a great pleasure to introduce Major Brad Halse. He's the Territorial Government Relation Manager in the Australian Southern Territory. Let's give him a hand.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for your attendance. It's the last session, what we call the graveyard session. Do you call that the same thing over in your part of the world? It's a challenge, staying very bright and with it. But it's a good subject to talk about, and I will try and keep within the time limit. As Colonel Seymour said yesterday when she spoke, if you can understand my accent and you don't really need to read the notes, a bit of eye contact is good, but that's your call. But you don't have to read the notes. What I'm saying is all there, you don't have to take notes. So it's a pleasure to be here. The question is, how can one army develop comprehensive solutions to international problems? I've taken the context for this very much as not the debate around one army being the evangelical arm and the social arm, but rather how can we work as one army across territories and across national boundaries, and particularly in relation to the subjects, the example subject that we're talking about. Can we work together as one army? It's an interesting question, one which has been asked a multitude of times, certainly within the army, but less often, in my experience, from outside, from politicians, from the media, from academics, and from the interested public. And why is that the case? It's because they start with the assumption that, of course, we work together as one army across nations. They're not even really interested in our territorial boundaries. How could it be otherwise? The notion of working together, of course, is much harder to attain than merely to talk about. Ideology and organisational philosophy, even theology, do not always translate into practice or even fundamentally shape policy. But now, as much as ever, we need to revisit this question. And for a number of reasons, not the least of which are financial and human resource efficiencies, and maintaining an organisational or a church ethos that fundamentally reflects Christian faith, theology and spirituality. For me, however, primarily the main reason may be that we need to recognise our world has changed dramatically in recent decades. Our social reality is in so many ways revolutionised, and to some degree, some of these changes have not yet been integrated into Salvation Army practice globally. At least that's the view I have from where I sit. The principal change that should prompt us to tackle this matter is simply the globalisation of the world. Economics, communications, organisational structures in both the business and the not-for-profit world have been globalised. Our environment is very fundamentally different. There are benefits, of course, in this, and there are also negative outcomes, but regardless of how much we analyse the changes which have happened, there's no turning back. It's a different world to what it was 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, certainly 20 years ago. The world is not going to return to something like a neat federation of independent nations and alliances, if indeed it ever was. But we as part of the Church Universal, as a global army, as a major welfare provider, need to recognise and deal with this reality as a matter of priority. We are responding in parts of the army world, and I'll briefly share some examples in this paper, but I think it would be fair comment to say that these examples do not yet typify the way the army operates globally. Let me say that I have doubts regarding the extent to which our territories and commands around the world actually do work together. And apart from a natural scepticism born of a journalism background, I cite the example of my own nation, Australia. Australia is an incredibly fortunate nation. We're wealthy by most standards. We enjoy one of the highest standards of living in the world, and we enjoy a very stable democratic political system, which on the whole is in pretty good shape. And within this context, we have an army which comprises two territories: the Australia Southern, from which I hail, headquartered in Melbourne, the Australian Eastern Territory, headquartered in Sydney. In terms of the Salvation Army world, our two territories are well resourced, and to a significant degree we reflect the broader wealth of the Australian society and economy. And yet, in many ways, and in many areas of social policy and service provision, our two territories have always had some significant difficulties in working together. Whether we're talking about the service areas of housing and homelessness, or asylum seekers and refugees, or drug and alcohol rehab, or any other number of services or programs centred around our evangelical mission, we continue at times to have trouble working as one army. And I have some of my colleagues from the Eastern Territory here, and we would acknowledge that, I think, in most regards. Not apportioning blame to either side, but two territories, we have some tensions. Many of you at this conference come from a vastly different national and geopolitical context. For some of you, like those from our host nation here in the States, there are multiple territories in the one country. And that must bring its own significant challenges in working and presenting as one army. For others in the room, your army context may be a territory which comprises 2, 3 or more nations, be that in the African context or a European or Asian one. The challenges for you must be very significant. If a wealthy nation like Australia sees an army comprising just 2 territories, having trouble at times working in a unified manner, then we should not underestimate the challenge in other parts of the world. However, the imperatives are before us and we have to devise good methods to achieve good outcomes. I want to speak of 2 examples briefly to encourage debate. One looked like being a terrific example of the army working together creatively and practically, only to stumble as it was about to get going due to external circumstances. The other example is up and running, and over the next few years hopefully will produce very good outcomes. The first example comes from Taiwan and involves that territory seeking to work in partnership with our Indonesian and Philippine territories in direct service provision, further partnering with the British and Australia Eastern Territories in terms of funding support. And finally, that partnership for this program was rounded out to be a 6-member partnership because of the role which IHQ needed to play in the development of this overall program. In very quick and simple terms, a model was developed involving the Taiwan, Indonesian and Philippine territories to identify, care for and allow the appropriate repatriation to Indonesia and the Philippines of women who had been trafficked to Taiwan for the sex trade and or the domestic servitude industry. The previous leaders of the army in Taiwan were 2 Australian officers who I know very well, Majors Michael and Annette Coleman. They had worked at great length with their counterparts in the other countries, territories and with IHQ to develop a strong working model. And this work was then carried forward by their successor in Taiwan as a regional commander, Lieutenant-Colonel Jennifer Groves. In developing this cross-territorial model, specifically titled the Pathway Home Network, and it would have been good if you're able to read that, but there's too much reading to do, but I'm told that you could access that if you're at all interested, for example, from the International Centre for Social Justice. They could make that available. It's a very good model to look at. In developing this, these territories identified particular risks. They're worth noting. Not in order of priority, they were financial loss, there are occupational health and safety issues, potential damage to the Army's reputation, legal problems, a loss of continuity, particularly in terms of leadership because of Army people being moved on, a loss of engagement from one of the partner territories, and finally the geopolitical risks, as it were, that the risks to the cross-territorial partnership which come from outside the Army. These risks are important to consider when establishing working partnerships in the context of one Army. In the case of this Pathways Home Network, it was the last of the identified risks, the geopolitical one, which brought this promising initiative to a halt. Early last year, the Taiwanese government, which was clearly a significant stakeholder in developing the model, facilitating places for women who had been trafficked to live before they could be expatriated or repatriated home, changed its mind about a critical element of the model. At least that's as I understand it from speaking to the Colemans, and thereby making it unworkable. From the Army's perspective, it needed to be shelved. A lot of work had gone into this. It's a clear example of one of the risks being realised with disappointing results. External stakeholders, and not only governments, will have to be seriously considered when we try and develop these type of partnerships, and potential risks should be mitigated as best possible. At the very least, the Pathways Home experience demonstrates that we must be prepared for failure as well as success. The road to better globalisation within the Army will definitely be littered with casualties. What battle worth fighting has no such landscape? In speaking with Major Mike Coleman about the experience at some length, he identified certain challenges, and they are the actual difficulty in establishing multi-partner relationships should not be underestimated. Secondly, funding. It's always a challenge, both the amount and the term, the longevity of it. The third challenge is the long preparation time required to develop memorandums of understanding. We'll talk a bit about that. The need to liaise with and through international headquarters. There's no slight intended in that. It's a reality. The need to develop and maintain external stakeholder relationships, be they with governments or statutory agencies or other organisations and businesses. And finally, and some of these are closely linked, understanding and working with Salvation Army politics between territories and IHQ. While these challenges, together with the risks identified, may seem confronting, they're not insurmountable. Firstly, we should expect any process aimed at establishing solid, intelligent partnerships to be a challenging one. There are no shortcuts. Part of the answer is to identify the range of challenges and the depth of them, and to do that we need to invest significant time exploring the mutual interests of all stakeholders, not during the actual program development phase, but beforehand. It really is a case of investing time rather than spending it, or let alone wasting it. Issues around funding and the time needed to develop memorandums of understanding need also to be carefully considered. At the end of the day, however, whilst the time taken, particularly in the development of MOUs, can be frustrating, it is a necessity. And many of you will have experienced that when you're trying to engage, even within your own territory, with other bodies, but certainly if you're trying to work across territories and including, obviously, IHQ, it's a necessity. At the same time, it's incumbent upon IHQ, if it seeks to walk further down this global track, to expedite these processes as far as reasonable, without compromising program design, and to build on already established processes. This challenge also relates to the identified challenge of understanding and successfully navigating the various political processes and dynamics which come into play when different territories are trying to partner. The complexity of Salvation Army politics can still surprise us. Perhaps it shouldn't, but at the same time the message may be there to all leaders to remove as many of the barriers as is practical and is possible, to ease and to facilitate interterritorial relationships, and thereby mitigate some of the frustrating politics which exist in the Salvation Army. Finally, in relation to the challenges, there is the matter of external relationships. Government relationships will always loom large when this dynamic is being explored. From my perspective, as my role in the Southern Territory of the Australian context as the manager of government relations to try and facilitate good relationships with the Australian government, I know well the complex landscape which the Salvation Army needs to walk to try and build good relationships. There is simply no alternative but to invest time and energy into the building of these, always keeping our eye on the long-term game as distinct from immediate short-term outcomes. The questions of government relations is, as our friends discovered with the Pathways Home one, always going to be sensitive and crucial, and at any time a government, for its own reasons, can change its mind and a program comes to nothing. This discussion of the risks and the challenges in forming solid, well-planned partnerships may be seen by some of you to be too pessimistic. To the contrary. The second example, and others in the room will probably know this much better than me, that I talked with some Salvationist friends and workers within Europe, concerns the Army's European network of social services. And over recent years, it's developed multi-territory and multi-nation partnerships to help address major social problems. And their work is a shining light in the landscape. To intelligently consider how the Salvation Army may be involved in addressing such issues as human trafficking and the phenomenon of the Roma people within Europe, a great deal of energy and thinking has been invested in how the Army in Europe can develop programs which can be responsive and efficient. I will get this name wrong. Jerome, I've spoken to him, he'll be offended. Jerome Hungeling, that's an Australian version. The then chair of the European Network of Social Services was very much at the heart of developing the Army's European strategy, and I acknowledge his input and views to this matter, and also the input of Ms. Celine van den Bergdorf, also from the Netherlands territory, who was going to be here, but circumstances prevented that. I spoke with both of them at length. The result of their work and many others in Europe and at IHQ has been the endorsement last year by all European territorial and command leaders under the overall oversight of the Undersecretary, as I understand it, for Europe from IHQ, of the international model for working together on trafficking and Roma issues. I quote from their strategy document: "We envisage the Salvation Army as a single seamless organisation responding to the needs of trafficked persons. The Salvation Army will work across borders and boundaries to stop human trafficking through prevention, protection and reintegration, restoring hope, freedom and human dignity. A united and coordinated approach by the various bodies within TSA, they're listed there, is needed to fight this global evil and to provide a continuum of care together with partner organisations." Now, much time needed to be invested was what was stressed to me over several years within European territories and within IHQ to finally get a strategy articulated and accepted. There were no shortcuts. It was the collective experience of the network, working with IHQ and the various territories. It's a matter of playing the long game, and that can be frustrating for all of us. How well this new strategy for working with trafficked people will work? How well will it work? How much will it cost? Can the Army afford it in the long run? Will changing leadership at territorial and international headquarters potentially impede progress? These are unanswerable questions at this time, and evaluation needs to be central to the ongoing assessment, obviously. We should be optimistic, however, about the potential of this type of model, which sees territorial leaders prepared to cede a measure of control and responsibility to others in specific program areas so that prompt and timely responses can occur across territorial and national borders. What those involved in this project needed to get right in the first place was the strategy. They emphasised this greatly to me. It was important to identify the strategy to deal with issues of trafficking and the Roma people and then put in place the structure. And perhaps sometimes in the Army we've got that the wrong way around. We've had a structure and we tried to make a strategy fit the structure. There is real hope and optimism that this model can and will work, and if it can work in the European context, why not in other parts of the globe? Whilst the geographical context is highly significant in the European model, many of the principles and practices developed can surely be considered for other parts of the Army world. We will need to watch with great interest as to how this unfolds in practice. One final comment about a sometimes forgotten component in this pursuit of working and serving as one Army, and that is namely the local corps, and within those corps, the local Salvationists. What else is a corps? It is all very well and necessary to consider the larger structures of the Army when looking at this issue of one Army. We consider interterritorial partnerships, roles played by IHQ, THQs and other stakeholders, and by Salvation Army networks of social programs, and the list goes on. But at the heart of the Salvation Army are local corps and the people who constitute those corps. These corps and soldiers can be and should be absolutely integral to the Salvation Army serving as one army. In both the European model, which we looked at, and the Taiwanese one, the program designers saw the incredible value of people at a local level being integrated into the implementation of these services. It is about, to a significant degree, there being a strong utilisation of committed people at ground level. This should never be underestimated. The professionalisation of the Army and its services has sometimes led to a devaluation of the importance of the local corps. I close on a note of optimism that despite my cynicism in some regards and my Australian experience, the world expects us to work as one army, to be a global army. And without resorting to naivety, we really need to respond. Such a response should not require us to forget that the strongest military forces of history have always had different regional commands and leaders. They have not been seamless. Nevertheless, the imperative to action is before us, and there is much to be done in this area. May God bless you, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Major Halse, for these excellent two examples. It's sometimes challenging to bring up an example where it didn't really succeed, but we can learn both from our successes and from our failures. So thank you very much for that. We have a response paper now by Mr. Bram Bailey from the SORSO U.S. National Headquarters, and we welcome him. Good. Give him a hand.
Okay, my comments, basically, they're comments and questions, but anyway. Consider the cost is, let's begin there. The Major quotes a strategy paper that is endorsed by the European territories. We envisage the Salvation Army as a single, seamless organization responding to the needs of trafficked people. A united, coordinated approach by the various bodies within the Salvation Army is needed to fight the global evil and to provide a continuum of care that we care together with partner organizations. The issue that the Salvation Army is called to address are indeed very complex, and the solutions will require cooperation within the Salvation Army, as well as government agencies, NGOs, and the affected people. We can probably all agree that a seamless, united, coordinated approach to the issues is ideal. To work together in this way, however, calls on those involved to be willing to give up autonomy, as the Major states in his paper, in order to overcome agreements. And particularly in a hierarchical organization such as the Salvation Army, this can and is difficult, but it is possible. Another point is the implications that we need to understand in relation to the structure and the giving up of autonomy. Now, strategy and structure, form follows function. The Major notes that to identify the strategy to deal with issues and then put in place the structure. We do not fully have that option because the Salvation Army structure through which we accomplish our mission has been in place for 150 years. To be successful, we need to use the strengths of the structure while working to develop united approaches to the complex issues we are called to address. For example, the Philippines territory mobilized to meet the needs of the many affected by the super typhoon that hit in November. It reached out for funding and personnel to international emergency services and territories in the US, Canada, Hong Kong, Europe, and others. Although still in the emergency response phase, the Philippines territory recently brought together representatives from the various territories for a long-term strategy meeting. This is an example of successfully working together and using the strengths of our Army system. We need to learn from these successes and use the lessons learned to address more complex issues. My third point, globalization. Major refers to globalization as an accomplished fact with which we must deal rather than an ongoing process. He states the world is not going to return to a federation of independent nations and allegiances. Yet that is what we still are, and for many reasons, what we should remain. I agree with Schiller, who is a sociologist, who states that a standard complaint about globalization is that it leads to cultural homogeneity. Interaction and integration diminishes differences. Global norms, ideas, or practices overtake local norms. Many culture flows, such as news, reflect effectively Western interests and ideas, and control and the cultural imperialism of places like the United States lead to the global spread of American symbols in popular culture, which is not necessarily a good thing. Yes, the world is a smaller, more connected place than it was decades ago. Yes, we need to take these challenges into account. One of the Salvation Army's strengths, however, is the combination of internationalism, our identity as one army, with our diversity, the various cultural expressions of that one army. In fact, one of the reasons donor organizations want to work with the Salvation Army is because we have both an overarching international identity combined with a strong local presence in communities around the globe. Our current way of working with IHQ focused on giving broad, overarching direction and leaving it to territories and commands to develop the context and cultural specific ways of implementing the direction at the field level must be maintained. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brad. Bram. They are always called either Brad or Bram, but this was a Bram, of the big family of the Baileys. So now we move on to Lieutenant-Colonel Marieke Venter. She's the Command President of Women's Ministry in the Bangladesh Command and the wife of the responder to one of the papers we had this morning. So we want to welcome you and introduce your paper. Let's give her a hand.
Good afternoon, and this is your last paper. So thank you for your attention, and after the Australian accent, it's time to listen to the South African accent, which I hope will be clear. As clear as the Australian was, of course. I was given a specific task in speaking about how can one army develop comprehensive solutions to international problems, in that I was asked to speak about human trafficking specifically. So I will not address issues like migration, other types of migration, or refugees, or asylum seekers, or any of those issues, but simply about human trafficking. And it's defined as, and I wasn't sure if a definition was needed, but here it is, by the UN, the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. Now that we've come through that, I would like to tell you a story to introduce the reality of human trafficking and one army. And it's a story of Julia, a Salvationist soldier, on her way to the bank in downtown Johannesburg, when she spotted some woman in conversation with a small girl who seemed to be the center of their attention. Julia stopped to ask if anything was wrong. She discovered that Maria, aged 7, had been found alone outside a shop. Maria was from a remote village in Mozambique and had been brought to Johannesburg by a friend of the family, who had told her that her mother had said she should go with her. Maria had told the woman that found her about the journey, including climbing over fences, through fences, and hiding in the back of a lorry. Julia, the Salvationist, remembered a short, informative talk she had heard in her corps the previous Sunday about human trafficking and what the Salvation Army is doing to prevent it. She didn't go to the bank that day, after all. She called her corps officer and stayed with the child until someone from the anti-human trafficking task team arrived. The Salvation Army's children's home was called, and they agreed to take Maria and undertook to deal with the necessary formalities. Maria stayed there for several months while efforts were made to get her home. Working with her embassy and the international social welfare networks was slow, until one day when THQ Southern Africa made a call to THQ Mozambique. Could the Salvation Army try and visit Maria's home? Could we try from both sides of the border to untangle the bureaucratic tape? As it turned out, there was a Salvation Army corps quite near Maria's village. Things started moving for Maria, and soon she was home with her family, unharmed and safe. We never discovered the purpose of her removal from her family. This little story illustrates the multidimensional Salvation Army response to a probable case of human trafficking. The corps raising basic awareness, a soldier applying her knowledge and taking responsibility, an army institution providing shelter and administrative support, THQs working together, another corps in another territory responding by arranging an investigative visit with the family, and continues to monitor Maria's progress. So I want to speak about one army, and I want to speak about our strengths, first of all. One of the Salvation Army's greatest strengths is our presence. We are present in cities, suburbs, towns, villages, extending to some of the remotest places in the world. We are not confined to offices, but are found at grassroots level, within communities on all levels of society. If something happens in a community, no matter how large or small, local Salvationists will know about it. How is this possible? Not necessarily, and certainly not only because of our officers and professional staff members, but also because of our soldiers, junior soldiers, adherents. This presence of people is a double asset, which we should never undervalue. I use the term double asset for this reason. Firstly, every soldier, junior soldier, adherent, employee has a home, a family, a community. Each one has knowledge. What happens in his or her small part of the world is knowledge. And this knowledge, if heard, shared, and understood, is powerful. Secondly, not only does each individual have knowledge, but each individual also has influence. Some are in high offices like government, law enforcement, justice, business. Some are children or students or unemployed or retired people. They all have influence in some way in their own community. This influence of more than 1.7 million people should never be underestimated. Julia went into the city with knowledge of her own city and what was going on in its streets, and some very basic knowledge about human trafficking, which was shared from the platform on Sunday. She also carried with her some influence. When she asked for information, she received it. When she said, "I'm a Salvationist, we can help you," she was believed. And this leads me to a second strength that we have, and that is a good name. People believe that the Salvation Army can make a difference. They believe it because we proved it in the past. They believe it because we are still telling them that today, through our advertising, through our public relations. And it is my firm belief and experience that people, the public, think of us often more highly than we think even of ourselves. We are one army, present almost everywhere, in all levels of society, with knowledge and with influence. And whether people know us as musicians or medical experts or disaster experts or feeders of the hungry or preachers of the gospel or ringing of bells, we have one reputation, and it is thus far a good one. A strength we should never take for granted is that we have the approval of heaven. I agree with Danielle Strickland, who in her address to the Canadian Parliament some years ago expressed her strong conviction that light is more powerful than darkness, and God is on our side. We are one army and hold a privileged position, and what a position of strength. However, when it comes to a challenge like human trafficking, let us not be too quick to pat ourselves on the back as the bringers of the solution. When we stand against human trafficking, we stand against the very kingdom and armies of Satan himself. Its source is the most evil kind of greed and cruelty. It involves not just petty criminals, but international masterminds and syndicates. We are up against forces of evil who will stop at nothing and respect no one. They are legions, and we are what we are, one army. And that leads me to my second point, one army, our limitations and challenges. During our 149-year battle against all kinds of evil, the Salvation Army has gathered masses of knowledge, experience, expertise, skills, and resources. We have become experts and authorities in many fields. We could almost say we have mastered it all. Almost, but not quite. Human trafficking is highly organized, violent, secretive, hidden, and deeply evil. We as one army can fight against human trafficking, and God is on our side. But we are not equipped, nor can we be expected to, nor would it be wise to try and deal with it on our own. Human trafficking is bigger than us. It's not bigger than God, but it is bigger than the Salvation Army alone. To fight human trafficking requires all the many skills we have, and also some which we do not have. We can raise awareness, educate, train, advocate, care for victims and survivors, support families, and do a host of other things. But we do not do lawmaking, law enforcement, border control, criminal investigations, arrests, trials, sentencing, international negotiations, and many other specialized activities surrounding this crime. Our earliest encounter with human trafficking, as we know now, was the adventure of the Maiden Tribute. An adventure which cannot be detailed in this paper, but which involved the confrontation of the sale of young girls into forced prostitution in the 19th century England, and ended with the exposure of slavery and the raising of the age of consent as a result of a partnership between Bramwell Booth, journalist W.T. Stead, and a Mrs. Josephine Butler. The point I wish to make in referring to this is that even in those early days, the Salvation Army did not approach the issue alone, but in a relationship of cooperation and interdependence with like-minded individuals. We return briefly to Maria's story. Even the 6, or actually I think 5, levels of Salvation Army involvement were not sufficient to ensure her safe return home. A medical examination was required at a special children's clinic. National and international child welfare had to be involved. The embassy had to do its part. A police report had to be filed. And Maria's case was probably by no means the most complicated case the Salvation Army ever came up against relating to human trafficking. Maria's story taught us many things, including the importance of networking. I'm fascinated by the way construction takes place in my current country, Bangladesh. When they build a building, the framework goes up using steel rods, and as the concrete floors in the multi-storied buildings are put in place, they are supported by hundreds of bamboo sticks or stems set about 1 foot apart from each other, each cut to the same length, each helping to carry the weight of the next level until the walls are in place. To construct a fortress against something like human trafficking will take many bamboo sticks, if you like. Working as part of a team brings advantages and a better chance of success, but let us be warned, it also brings frustrations. As part of a network of any kind, we are expected to keep the rules, but we don't always get to make the rules or agree with the rules. Recently, and I'm very glad Major Halse already told the story about the pathway home. Yes, I'm referring to that same example over here. A project with great potential of multi-country success had to be shelved because of a government rule, which would impair its success significantly. So lastly, One Army, our contribution. As One Army, we have been team members for justice on this issue for years. In fact, we have been team leaders in many ways. Having spearheaded the fight against human trafficking in some territories, I acknowledge the work of Commissioner Helen Clifton and the establishment of the Faith Alliance Against Trafficking and Slavery, of which the Salvation Army was a founding member, as well as the leadership of the Salvation Army International Social Justice Commission, to name but a few groundbreakers. Our international position on human trafficking reads, the Salvation Army is deeply committed to fighting human trafficking. However it may be manifested, we seek to exercise care in restoring the freedom and dignity of those affected. I offer the following thoughts in answer to the question, how can One Army develop comprehensive solutions to international problems? Firstly, cooperation is vital for any effective response, cooperation between territories and between ourselves and our partners. Secondly, we must continue to increase knowledge and awareness. All our units and members can and should be informed about the issue of human trafficking. We should proclaim the gospel message, which includes freedom from exploitation. From our platforms in Sunday schools, youth groups, boardrooms, communities. Thirdly, conducting and sharing of ongoing research and documentation. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime names the lack of knowledge #1 challenge in the implementation of comprehensive responses to human trafficking or trafficking in persons. They say lack of knowledge hinders the effective implementation of anti-trafficking policies and strategies, since often they are based on political, social, and economic agendas rather than actual facts. However, it should be kept in mind that data collection on trafficking in persons is a challenging task which requires focused and continuous efforts to keep the knowledge base updated. This may include creating a data bank of resources, including knowledge, information, skills, experience, as well as reference to the multitude of specialized training materials and manuals dealing with trafficking, which have been developed by national and international agencies. Fourthly, membership on national and international bodies should be prioritized. The following message comes from a combined research project in my country, South Africa. Government departments and NGOs that undertake membership of the National Task Team should also commit themselves in terms of allocating the required resources and ensuring that representatives are of sufficient seniority to act with authority. Continuity of representation is important. Number 5, it is important to continue to offer survivor-focused response. Every single occurrence of modern slavery is happening to a person, someone's sister, mother, brother, father, daughter, or son. To be ethical in our methods of recovery, rehabilitation models should preferably be self-determined and individually tailored, though this is costly and time-consuming. The model I referred to earlier, and that Major also referred to, would have been a great example, and it's recommended that the rehabilitation should take place in the country of origin where language and cultural barriers are minimized, although it's recognized this is not always possible. Number 6, and I'm nearly finished. There's an urgent need for monitoring and evaluation, and for answering the following questions. Are preventive efforts helping to decrease the number of victims of trafficking in persons? Is the provision of training sustainable, and is it increasing the capacity for action? Are the protective initiatives ensuring safety and strengthening the rights of victims? How can it be ensured that awareness-raising campaigns are appropriately targeted to have positive impact? The Salvation Army should continue to do what we do well, address the root causes of human trafficking. Poverty and the lack of social and economic security are major factors that push people into migration and into situations of vulnerability. Let us continue to work for economic development and promote education, especially for girls. Contrary to popular trends of donors, there is still a need for schools in many places. Let us continue building capacity of the poorest community. As one army, we continue to gratefully accept the financial resources of some territories to fight poverty and thus prevent trafficking in other territories. We should continue to support fair trade and ethical trading models and continue to raise awareness on exploitation of people on farms and factories. So, as stated in the US Department of State report, a new generation of informed and interested citizens is beginning to look inward and making the choice to reject lifestyles sustained by exploitation. For all who continue to live in bondage, this moment could not have come too soon. The new abolitionist movement has started. As one army, we are part of it. Our mission is the mission of Jesus, who said in Luke 4, verses 18 and 19, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind, to set the oppressed free and proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Thank you. May God bless you.
Thank you very much, Colonel, for this insightful paper. You can hear you speak from personal experience also in this work. As it was mentioned, Celine van den Berg was going to be the responder. Unfortunately, she's luckily pregnant. That is the reason why she's not here, so it's not that sad. But instead, we have another good person in the same staff of the Netherlands International Office, Mrs. Grethel. She works with us in the Netherlands, but she lives in the Caribbean. So now she's going to come and introduce the response paper. So give her a hand. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Lieutenant Colonel Venter's paper starts off by defining human trafficking and introduces this topic as the core of her paper. Based on the magnitude of this problem in the developed and developing world, I fully support the importance of a joint response to this international issue. However, the variety of issues originating and symptomatic in different countries and encountered by the Salvation Army on a daily basis urges me to broaden international problems to encompass other issues such as seasonal workers, displaced and asylum seekers, traveling populations such as Roma, Sinti, travelers, etc. Although the reasons for which they have left their countries often vary, all of these target groups face similar problems: vulnerability, exclusion, exploitation, lack of access to basic services, etc. In most countries where we work, the Salvation Army meets them in our core, centers and communities. Finding ways for the Salvation Army to effectively serve these populations in a comprehensive and sustainable way is of utmost importance. There are only a handful of international organizations with a grassroots presence in over 126 countries. Therefore, the question rightly is, how can we do this? And not, can we do it? Lieutenant Colonel Venter gives some suggestions which I all support, but also would like to add the following comments. International cooperation. Many existing Salvation Army structures can enable a comprehensive approach, such as the IHQ zonal structure. We can develop a pilot comprehensive approaches within one zone. As an example, we heard from Mozambique and South Africa, or such as are currently being developed in the Europe zone. This provides various benefits. The zonal office at IHQ can provide an invaluable coordinating and supporting role to various territories working together. it can be assumed that a joint basic understanding of the context of receiving and sending countries in which is being worked exists or can easily be acquired within zonal working groups. Comprehensive reconnection programs can be a zonal priority, not living up to the priority of a territory only. Limited distances can enable monitoring and evaluation activities of reconnection programs. Learning from the success of individual cases is vital to effective future programs. External cooperation. Let us actively search for external partners that share the same concerns for the target groups, but apply different strategies to approach the problem. For instance, lobby, advocacy, strengthening civil society, etc. We need more complementary partnership. Root causes. Some of the root causes remain insufficiently addressed by us due to lack of knowledge or experience. The Salvation Army could develop more. In-depth knowledge of local context, like context analysis, understanding and knowledge of causes and effects of international problems and how they can be effectively addressed. Programs aimed at creating local opportunities for income generation, such as livelihoods and programs. Thank you to both our speakers and their contribution to this important topic. Thank you.
Yes, and if Celine is watching us online, we say thank you to Celine, and we say thank you to Gretel for presenting the paper. Now it's up to you to work, and thank you in advance. I believe that the groups this morning did excellent work, and we are trying to collect some of the expressions from each table. So continue the good work for the next half an hour, and that will most likely bring good results.